We never touched a black man before. The three Japanese women told the young U.S. soldier. September 23, 1945. Camp 17, Okinawa Prefecture. The transport truck's engine coughed and died as Private First Class James Mitchell stepped down onto coral gravel, still stained with the residue of war. 4 months after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, the young soldier from Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood found himself assigned to what Army records classified as a displaced persons facility, though everyone knew what it really was. A holding camp for the human wreckage of Imperial Japan's collapse. 22 years old, 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who had loaded steel in River Rouge factories before the war, James carried his M1 rifle with the casual competence of someone who had seen combat, but preferred not to think about it. His orders were simple: guard duty, 12-hour shifts. Ensure the detainees received Geneva Convention treatment. The irony wasn't lost on him. A black man from a segregated city, sent to enforce humanitarian standards in a place where humanity had been systematically destroyed. The camp housed 147 souls, according to the morning roster. Most were Korean laborers who had been worked nearly to death in Japanese mines. 32 were Filipino women rescued from military brothels. And then there were the 3 Japanese women who occupied Barracks 7, separated from the others by order of the camp commander, Captain Theodore Walsh, a West Point graduate from Connecticut who believed in order above all else. James first saw them through the wire mesh of their barracks window at 1400 hours. 3 figures in faded cotton shifts that had once been white, now the color of old newspaper. They sat on wooden bunks, motionless as photographs, their faces turned toward the sound of his approaching boots. Sergeant Robert Harris, a career Army man from Tennessee with silver threading his temples and 36 months of Pacific combat behind him, performed the introductions with the formality of a museum guide. These 3 were recovered from a facility outside Naha, Japanese military comfort station. That's what the reports call it anyway. The oldest one, that's Yumi Tanaka, 31 years old, former school teacher. The one with the scar on her left arm, that's Emiko Watanabe, 24. She was a nurse before they took her. The youngest, Suki Kobayashi, just 18. Hell, Mitchell, she's younger than most of the guys in our unit. James nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He had expected enemy soldiers, perhaps, civilians who hated Americans. He hadn't expected to see fear so naked it made his chest ache. Harris continued, his voice dropping lower. Intelligence says these women were enslaved by their own military, not prisoners of war in the conventional sense. Victims. That's why they're separated. Some of the Korean women, they don't want to be near Japanese nationals. Can't say I blame them. When James entered the barracks that first time, carrying the evening meal rations, rice with preserved vegetables, all 3 women pressed themselves against the far wall. Yumi, the eldest, positioned herself in front of the younger 2, her thin arms spread wide in a gesture of protection that broke something inside James he hadn't known was whole. "It's all right," he said quietly, setting the metal containers on the wooden table that served as the barracks' only furniture besides the bunks. "I'm just bringing dinner, that's all." Yumi's eyes, dark and unreadable, studied him with an intensity that made James feel transparent. When she finally spoke, her English was precise, shaped by years of teaching, but her voice trembled with something James couldn't quite identify. Fear, confusion, perhaps something closer to disbelief. "We never touched a black man before," she said, the words emerging slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. Behind her, Emiko and Suki remained frozen, their faces reflecting the same mixture of terror and curiosity that James had seen in his own mirror years ago, walking past white neighborhoods where he knew he wasn't welcome. The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with everything unspoken. Propaganda, prejudice, the 1,000 small and large lies that war required to turn humans into enemies. James looked at these three women, survivors of horrors he could only imagine, and recognized something fundamental. They had been taught to fear him for the same reason he had been taught to fear them, because fear was easier than understanding. Before you continue listening, please let me know, where in the world are you watching from today? Now back to the story. September 24th through October 2nd, 1945. The first 10 days of James Mitchell's assignment to Barracks 7 followed a pattern that would have been unremarkable if not for what it represented. Each morning at 0600 hours, he delivered breakfast. Rice porridge, sometimes with dried fish, occasionally with pickled vegetables when supplies permitted. Each evening at 1800 hours, dinner. The routine was identical to that of the other guards serving the other barracks. The difference was invisible, but absolute. The camp's logistics officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb from Baltimore, documented in his daily reports that Barracks 7 consumed their full rations. This detail, buried in paperwork that no one would read for decades, represented a quiet revolution. In other sections of the camp, particularly those housing Japanese nationals, detainees often refused food from American hands. Pride, shame, the complex mathematics of defeat. According to Red Cross observers who visited Camp 17 on October 1st, 9 Japanese civilians in the general population had required medical intervention for malnutrition despite adequate food availability. The 3 women in Barracks 7 ate everything James brought them. On the 3rd day, Yumi Tanaka began speaking to him. Not conversations exactly, more like statements delivered to the air, as if she were teaching an invisible classroom. In our schools, they told us Americans were demons. They said your soldiers would destroy everything Japanese, our culture, our language, our lives. She paused, stirring her rice with wooden chopsticks James had requisitioned from the camp supply depot. They were very specific about black soldiers. They said you would be the worst. James, standing in the doorway per regulations that forbade guards from entering detainee quarters without cause, listened without responding. Sergeant Harris had taught him this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone is silence that doesn't judge. On the 5th day, James noticed that Suki Kobayashi, the youngest, was wearing the same torn canvas shoes that had likely carried her from whatever hell the Japanese military had created. The soles were separating from the uppers. Her feet were developing blisters. At 1900 hours after his shift ended, James walked 3 miles to the supply depot and requested women's shoes, size approximately 5 American, from medical necessity. Staff Sergeant William Chen, the quartermaster from San Francisco's Chinatown, raised an eyebrow. Medical necessity, huh? The Jap girls in 7? Detainees in Barracks 7, James corrected quietly. And yeah, can't have someone developing foot infections. Geneva Convention requires we maintain health standards. The shoes, standard Women's Army Corps issue in black leather, arrived 2 days later. James left them inside the barracks door with a handwritten note. For Suki. The young woman cried when she found them, silent tears that Emiko later described in a diary discovered by occupation authorities in 1948. On October 2nd, a Red Cross representative, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons from Philadelphia, conducted her scheduled inspection of Camp 17. Her report, filed in Geneva and later archived in Washington, noted with approval the condition of all detainees. but she added a personal observation that appeared nowhere in the official documentation. In a letter to her sister dated October 7th, she wrote, "There is a young colored soldier here, barely more than a boy really, who has somehow convinced 3 Japanese women that Americans are not monsters. I watched him deliver their evening meal. They actually smiled at him. I have been inspecting these camps for 8 months now, and I have never seen a Japanese national smile at an American soldier. Whatever he is doing, it should be studied and replicated." What James was doing was simple. He shared his chocolate ration. K-Ration chocolate bars, bitter and waxy, designed for energy, not pleasure. American soldiers complained about them constantly. To women who hadn't tasted sugar in months, they were treasures from an impossible world. "In Japan," Emiko said on the 8th day, accepting the small brown square with both hands in a gesture that looked almost ceremonial, "sugar has been impossible to find since 1943. Even before that, only children and the military received sweets. You give this to us so easily." "My mama used to say that food tastes better when it's shared," James replied. It was the most personal thing he had told them. "She fed half of Detroit during the Depression. Never turned anyone away from our door, even when we barely had enough ourselves." Yumi, who had been listening while mending a tear in Suki's dress with thread James had provided, looked up sharply. "Your mother fed strangers? Even when you were hungry?" "Especially then," James said. "She told me that's when it matters most. When you have a little, and you share it anyway." The silence that followed was different from the frightened quiet of the first days. This silence felt like something breaking open, like ice fracturing under spring sun. Later, in the diary that would eventually be donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Yumi would write, "Today I understood that the enemy we were taught to fear was himself taught to give. This contradiction is breaking my understanding of the world." October 7th, 1945, 2200 hours. James Mitchell was supposed to be off duty, sleeping in the enlisted men's barracks that housed 42 soldiers in rows of metal bunks that smelled like canvas, sweat, and the peculiar tropical mildew that infected everything on Okinawa. Instead, he was running through darkness toward Barracks 7, summoned by a frantic Corporal Eddie Hayes from Brooklyn, who had been pulling night watch and who now looked terrified in a way that combat hadn't managed. "Something's wrong with one of the Japanese girls," Hayes gasped, his words tumbling over each other. "The middle one. She's burning up, talking crazy, and the other 2 are screaming for help. I don't know what to do, Mitchell. Protocol says call the medical officer, but Captain Walsh left standing orders that after 2100 hours, we don't disturb medical unless it's American personnel or combat-related." Captain Theodore Walsh, West Point class of 1938, believed in regulations the way some men believed in God. His standing orders filled 3 typed pages posted in every guard station. Non-emergency situations involving detainees were to be addressed during normal duty hours. The camp's medical officer, First Lieutenant Donald Pierce from Michigan, was to be summoned only for Americans or for situations that threatened camp security. Everything else could wait until morning. James knew the regulations. He also knew that Emiko Watanabe was dying. She lay on her wooden bunk, soaked in sweat despite the cool October night. Her temperature, measured by a combat first aid thermometer carried in his field kit, registered 103.7 degrees. Dangerously high. Potentially fatal if it climbed higher. Yumi knelt beside her, using a torn piece of cloth dipped in their drinking water to wipe Emiko's forehead. Suki, the youngest, huddled in the corner, her new shoes clutched against her chest like a talisman, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from watching people die and knowing you were powerless to stop it. "How long has she been like this?" James asked, his medic training from basic combat courses automatically taking over. Check vital signs, assess the situation, determine the threat level. "Since sunset," Yumi replied in English that remained precise even in crisis. "She complained of headache earlier today, then fever. Now she says things that make no sense. She speaks to people who are not here." Delirium. Possible malaria, though the timing was wrong. More likely some infection that had been festering for days or weeks, held back by a body already weakened by malnutrition and trauma, finally overwhelming her system. James had seen this before, on Luzon, on Peleliu. Infection could kill as efficiently as bullets, and it killed slower. He had three choices: follow protocol and wait for morning medical hours, risking Emiko's life; wake Lieutenant Pierce and face whatever punishment Captain Walsh decreed for violating standing orders; or treat her himself with the limited supplies available and hope it was enough. The Geneva Convention, which James had been required to memorize, stated in Article 15 that belligerents must treat sick prisoners of war humanely and provide necessary medical care. The Japanese women in Barracks 7 existed in a category the convention hadn't anticipated. Neither prisoners of war nor civilians, but the principle seemed clear enough. Necessary medical care. Now. Not in 8 hours when the medical officer's duty hours commenced. James made his decision in the time it took his heart to beat twice. "Hayes, get me the medical supplies from the guard station, everything in the emergency kit, and find me clean water, as much as you can carry. Move." While Hayes ran, James knelt beside Emiko. Her eyes opened, unfocused, and she spoke rapidly in Japanese. Yumi translated softly. "She says the Americans are burning her village. She says she must hide the children. She is remembering things that happened years ago." "Tell her she's safe," James said, pulling aspirin from his personal first aid kit. "Tell her she's going to be okay." Yumi translated. Emiko's hand suddenly gripped James's wrist with surprising strength. She stared at him, and for a moment her eyes cleared. When she spoke in English, her voice was a whisper that barely reached him. "Why are you helping me? They told us you would hurt us. They were very clear. Americans would show no mercy. Black Americans would be worst of all." James had no answer that would satisfy military protocol or political theory. He only had the truth his mother had taught him in Detroit, feeding strangers during the Depression. "Because you're sick," he said simply, "and I can help. That's all that matters." He spent the night in Barracks 7, violating at least 7 separate regulations. He reduced Emiko's fever with aspirin and cool water compresses. He monitored her breathing, her pulse, the color of her skin. At 0300 hours, her temperature dropped to 100.2. At 0500, she slept naturally instead of thrashing in delirium. At 0600, when Sergeant Harris arrived for morning inspection and found James still kneeling beside a Japanese woman's bunk, the older man simply nodded once and walked away without comment. October 8th through October 20th, 1945. In the 13 days following Emiko Watanabe's illness, something shifted in Barracks 7 that the official camp records would never capture. The change was invisible to Captain Walsh's daily inspections and absent from Lieutenant Webb's logistics reports. But it was real, documented only in personal letters that soldiers wrote home and in diary entries that 3 Japanese women filled with handwriting that trembled between 2 languages. Emiko recovered slowly. Lieutenant Pierce, the medical officer, examined her on October 8th after Sergeant Harris quietly informed him that one of the Japanese detainees had experienced a medical emergency during the night. Pierce's official diagnosis was Acute fever of unknown origin, possibly viral, possibly bacterial, resolved through basic supportive care. His unofficial opinion, shared with Harris over coffee in the officers' mess, was more direct. That colored kid, Mitchell, probably saved her life. If she'd waited until morning, the fever might have spiked higher, could have caused permanent brain damage or worse. Whatever trouble he's in for breaking protocol, make sure Walsh knows that. James received a formal reprimand from Captain Walsh for violating standing orders. The reprimand was filed in his personnel record with a note that cited mitigating circumstances and Geneva Convention obligations. Sergeant Harris, who had served under 3 different commanders in 2 different theaters, recognized the reprimand for what it was: Walsh's way of following the rules, while acknowledging that sometimes the rules didn't cover reality. The real consequence came from the 3 women in Barracks 7. They began to talk. Yumi Tanaka had been a teacher at a girls' school in Kyoto before the war. On October 10th, she told James about her classroom. 32 students, aged 13 to 16. She had taught them literature, history, calligraphy. I told them about the Genji Monogatari, she said, referring to the ancient Japanese novel that scholars considered one of the world's first. I taught them about our culture, our traditions. Then the military came to my school. They said we would be teaching different lessons now. Lessons about duty to the emperor, about sacrifice for the nation. She paused, folding her hands in her lap. They came for me 3 months later, said teachers were needed for military education programs. I believed them. I was a fool. James listened without interrupting. He had learned this from Sergeant Harris, who had learned it from 20 years in the Army. Sometimes people needed to speak their truth into the air, to hear it acknowledged by another human being who wouldn't turn away. Emiko's story emerged in pieces over several days. She had been training as a nurse in Osaka when the military requisitioned her medical school. They told us we would serve our country by healing wounded soldiers. This was true, technically, but healing was not the only service they required. Her voice remained steady, but her hands shook when she spoke. The things I witnessed, the things I was forced to do. Your propaganda told you that Japanese were monsters, but we created our own monsters. We did it to ourselves. Suki Kobayashi, the youngest, spoke least but revealed most. On October 15th, during James's evening meal delivery, she approached him directly for the first time. My father was a fisherman in Hokkaido, she said in halting English that improved daily through conversations with the 3 of them. He taught me about the ocean, about respecting the sea because it gives life but can take it away. The military taught me to fear everything. They said Americans would destroy Japan. They were very specific about soldiers like you. What did they say about soldiers like me? James asked gently. Suki looked at her feet, at the black leather shoes he had obtained for her. They said black American soldiers were animals. Worse than animals. They said you would hurt us in terrible ways. They showed us pictures, told us stories, made us believe these things until we were more afraid of you than of dying. She raised her eyes to meet his. But you brought me shoes. You sat with Emiko all night when she was sick. You shared your chocolate even though we are your enemy. I do not understand this. Nothing I was taught explains this. The conversations expanded beyond simple exchanges. James told them about Detroit, about growing up in Black Bottom, a neighborhood named for the dark soil that had once covered the area, now home to black families who had migrated north seeking factory work, and finding segregation different from the South, but segregation nonetheless. He told them about his mother, Loretta Mitchell, who had worked as a domestic servant in white homes while raising 3 children alone after his father died in a factory accident. "My mama used to say that hate was expensive," James said one evening, sitting just outside the barracks door while the 3 women sat just inside, this small distance maintaining protocol while allowing conversation. "Said it cost you more than whoever you were hating. She told me, 'James, you're going to meet people who hate you for your skin color. Don't you dare give them that power over you. Don't you dare start hating back, because then they've won twice.'" Yumi translated this for Suki, whose English was still developing. Then Yumi spoke quietly. "Your mother was wise. In Japan, we have a saying, 'Urami wa urami wo yobu.' Hatred calls forth hatred. It creates a cycle that cannot be broken." She paused. "I believed Americans were this cycle's source. I was wrong." By October 20th, the evening meal deliveries had transformed into something the camp regulations had never anticipated: cultural exchange. James taught them about baseball, using a stick and a wadded-up cloth ball to demonstrate. They taught him basic Japanese phrases, laughing at his pronunciation while gently correcting him. Sergeant Harris, observing from a distance, noted in a letter to his wife in Tennessee, "Something remarkable is happening in Barracks 7. Can't quite put my finger on it, but it feels important. Like we're winning a war that never got declared." October 21st, 1945. 1900 hours. The evening meal had been delivered, consumed, and cleared. James Mitchell stood at his usual position outside Barracks 7, technically on duty, but functionally present in a way that transcended military protocol. Inside, the 3 women sat in their customary positions, Yumi on the edge of her bunk, her posture maintaining the dignity of a teacher, even in circumstances that had destroyed everything else. Emiko, cross-legged on the floor, her nurse's training evident in the way she unconsciously checked Suki's general health with quick glances. Suki, curled in the corner, her new shoes placed neatly beside her, symbols of something larger than footwear. The conversation that evening would not be recorded in any official document. Captain Walsh's daily inspection reports mentioned only that Barracks 7 remained orderly and that the Japanese female detainees continued to comply with camp regulations. The Red Cross observer, who visited on October 19th, had noted improved morale among all detainees. But what transpired that evening existed in a space between documentation and memory, preserved only in diaries that 3 women kept, and in letters James would write home weeks later. Yumi Tanaka spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 28 days reconsidering everything she had believed about the world. "Mitchell-san," she began, using the Japanese honorific that signified respect. "May I ask you something that I have been thinking about for many days?" "Yes, ma'am," James replied, using the courtesy his mother had taught him, the same courtesy that white Detroit had often refused to extend to him. "In Japan, before the war, I taught my students that civilization meant understanding hierarchy, that society functioned because everyone knew their place, the emperor above all, then military, then men, then women, then conquered peoples." She paused, her hands folded in her lap. "Americans, we were taught, had no civilization, no hierarchy, no understanding of proper order, particularly Black Americans. They told us you were at the bottom of your own society, angry and violent because you refused to accept your place." James felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "And now?" "Now, I see a man who knows his place perfectly," Yumi continued. Your place is wherever humanity needs defending. You did not have to bring Suki's shoes. You did not have to sit with Emiko through her fever. You did not have to share your chocolate, or your stories, or your mother's wisdom. You chose these things. This choice, I think, is what civilization actually means. Emiko Watanabe, who had been quiet, added her voice. In the medical corps, they taught us that Japanese bodies were superior, stronger, more resistant to disease. That American bodies were weak, corrupted by their mixed society. Then I developed a fever that should have killed me, and a black American soldier saved my life using supplies and knowledge that your military ensured even common soldiers possessed. Every Japanese field hospital I worked in was undersupplied, desperate, improvising. Yet you have aspirin, bandages, clean water, distributed to everyone, even your lowest-ranking soldiers. She laughed, but it was a laugh that held no humor. I spent 3 years believing propaganda about American weakness. Then, I experienced American strength. Real strength. Not conquest, not domination. The strength to heal your enemy. Suki Kobayashi, the youngest, had been crying silently. When she spoke, her words came in a mixture of Japanese and English, Yumi quietly translating the parts James couldn't follow. I was taught to fear you more than death. They showed us pictures, told us stories about what black American soldiers would do to Japanese women. These stories gave me nightmares. When you first entered this barracks, I thought my nightmares were becoming real. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Instead, you brought food, and medicine, and shoes, and kindness. Every day, you brought kindness. Now, when I have nightmares, they are not about you. They are about the people who taught me to fear you. The people who lied to us about everything. A long silence followed. The kind of silence that holds weight, that marks a moment as significant even as it unfolds. James could hear his own breathing, the distant sounds of the camp, somewhere a radio playing American music that would have been illegal in Japan during the war. Finally, Yumi spoke again. We thought we knew who you were. We thought we understood what Americans meant, what black Americans meant, what our enemy meant. But we were wrong about all of it. You are not our enemy. You never were. Our enemy was the people who taught us to hate. The people who took 3 women, 3 lives, and tried to turn us into weapons against our own humanity. She stood, approaching the doorway but maintaining the respectful distance that protocol required. I cannot speak for all Japanese people. I cannot undo the propaganda or the war or the terrible things my nation did. But I can say this. We 3 women in this barracks, we see you now. We see you as you are, not as we were told to see you. You are James Mitchell from Detroit, son of Loretta Mitchell, a man who shares his chocolate and sits through the night with the sick and brings shoes to strangers. This is what we will remember. This is what we will tell others when this war finally ends. Emiko nodded. They tried to teach us hate. You taught us something different. Not love, perhaps, too soon for that word, but something closer to understanding, closer to recognizing that the person we feared was just another person, fighting his own battles, carrying his own burdens, trying to do right in a world that makes right nearly impossible. Suki added softly, in careful English, "You showed us that enemy is a word people use, but human is what we actually are." James felt his throat tighten. He thought about his mother in Detroit, cleaning white people's homes while teaching her children that dignity came from within, not from how others treated you. He thought about the army, which had given him a rifle and a uniform, but still segregated him from white soldiers in most camps. He thought about these three women, survivors of horrors he would never fully understand, now telling him that his simple acts of decency had meant something. "My mama always said that we're all just trying to get home," James said quietly. "All of us, no matter where we come from or what we look like. Just trying to find our way back to something good. Maybe that's what this is. Not enemies finding peace. Just people finding their way home." Yumi smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from any of them. "Then perhaps we are all heading in the same direction after all." October 22nd through November 5th, 1945. The autumn weather on Okinawa shifted from tropical heat to something approaching comfortable. Temperatures dropped to the low 70s during the day, the 60s at night. This meteorological detail, recorded in the camp's daily weather log maintained by Corporal Michael Santos from New Mexico, would prove significant for reasons the weatherman never anticipated. Cooler evenings meant outdoor conversations became possible without the oppressive humidity that had made September unbearable. On October 24th, Sergeant Harris approached James with an unusual request. "Mitchell, the Red Cross sent over some additional rations. Coffee. Real coffee, not that instant garbage. Some canned peaches, crackers. They want us to improve detainee morale, show we're following Geneva Convention standards. I'm authorizing you to share evening rations with Barracks 7. Sit with them. Make it social, not just a food delivery." The authorization, documented in Harris's daily log with the notation, "Special rations distribution for morale purposes," transformed the evening meal routine. James began arriving at 1900 hours, carrying not just the standard rice and vegetables, but coffee in a thermos he had borrowed from the mess hall, canned peaches split among 4 small bowls, crackers that Americans called saltines, but which the three women treated like delicacies. The first shared meal occurred on October 25th. James sat outside the barracks door, the three women inside, the threshold between them both physical boundary and symbol of trust building. Yumi Tanaka accepted her bowl of peaches with both hands, studying the fruit suspended in syrup. "In Japan, canned goods were for military only. Even before rationing, only wealthy families could afford imported American foods. Now we eat American peaches as prisoners." "Former enemies eating together," James said, sipping coffee that tasted like home, like Detroit diners and his mother's kitchen. "My mama would say that's how peace actually starts, not with treaties, with people breaking bread together." Emiko Watanabe, whose English improved daily through constant practice, asked the question that had apparently been troubling her. "In America, do black families and white families eat together? The propaganda told us America was divided, that black Americans were treated terribly, that you lived in segregation, separate and inferior. Was this true?" James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he had to explain American racism to people who assumed America's ideals matched its reality. "It's complicated," he began, then stopped himself. These women deserved truth, not comfort. "Yes, we're segregated. In Detroit, where I'm from, black folks live in black neighborhoods. We have our own schools, churches, businesses. not by choice, by law in the South, by custom in the North. White restaurants won't serve us. White hotels won't rent to us. The army itself is segregated. Black soldiers, white soldiers, separate units. Suki Kobayashi, listening carefully, spoke in halting English supplemented by Yumi's translation. Then you understand. Being treated as less than human because of how you look. Being told you are inferior. Having your humanity denied. Yes, James said simply. The word hung in the evening air, heavy with shared experience that transcended enemy lines. Over the following days, the shared meals became extended conversations. James told them about the Great Migration, the movement of black families from the South to northern industrial cities seeking factory work and escape from Jim Crow laws. He explained how his father had died in a factory accident at River Rouge, how compensation had been denied because of a technicality, how his mother had cleaned white people's homes to keep 3 children fed. Yumi shared her teaching career, describing the Kyoto school where she had worked. I taught girls about Murasaki Shikibu, a woman who wrote the world's first novel 1,000 years ago. I wanted my students to understand that Japanese women had always been capable of greatness. Then the military came. They said women's greatness was measured differently now, through sacrifice, through serving men, through silence. The conversations revealed patterns neither side had expected. Both had experienced propaganda that dehumanized others. Both had lived in societies that claimed superiority while practicing cruelty. Both understood what it meant to be judged by circumstance rather than character. On November 3rd, Emiko asked James about his plans after the war. What will you do when this ends? Return to Detroit? James shrugged. Don't know if there's much waiting for me there. The factories hired black workers during the war because white men were fighting. Now, white men are coming home. Jobs are disappearing for folks who look like me. Army's the only place I've been treated almost equal. And even that's almost. So you fight for a country that treats you as less than equal, Yumi observed quietly. And we fought for a country that enslaved its own women. Perhaps we have more in common than either of us realized. The peaches were gone, the coffee was cold, but something warmer had been shared that evening. Understanding, hard-won and honest. The kind that only comes when people stop performing and start speaking truth. November 6th through November 18th, 1945. The educational transformation of Barracks 7 began unofficially and without authorization from Camp Command. It started with questions about America that the 3 women asked during evening conversations, questions that revealed how completely Japanese propaganda had distorted reality. James Mitchell, a high school graduate from a segregated Detroit school who had never imagined himself a teacher, found himself explaining a country that was simultaneously his home and his oppressor. On November 7th, Suki Kobayashi asked the question that would shape the next 2 weeks of conversations. Is it true that in America anyone can become rich? That poor people can rise to own businesses and factories? Or is this propaganda? James considered his response carefully. Sergeant Harris had taught him that truth was more powerful than comfortable lies. It's partly true and partly myth. America tells itself that anyone can succeed through hard work. Some people do. Most don't. Especially if you're black. But there's more opportunity than in places with rigid class systems. My mama's cousin owned a barber shop. Started with nothing. Saved enough to buy his own shop. That would have been almost impossible in a lot of countries. Yumi Tanaka, ever the teacher, pressed deeper. But you said black Americans face segregation. How can there be opportunity if you are kept separate? That's the contradiction America hasn't solved, James admitted.
We're told we're free and equal. The Constitution says it. But reality is different. Black folks create their own opportunities within the boundaries white America allows. We build our own businesses, our own institutions, not because we want to be separate, but because we're forced to be.
These conversations, documented in Yumi's diary that would eventually be donated to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in 1997, revealed a pattern. Both societies claimed superiority while practicing oppression. Both told their citizens they were special, chosen, inherently better. Both created enemies to justify their own failings. On November 10th, James brought something new to the evening gathering. A copy of Life magazine, dated October 15, 1945, that had arrived in the camp's recreation supplies. The magazine contained photographs of American life, cities with tall buildings, highways filled with automobiles, factories producing consumer goods, families eating dinner at kitchen tables loaded with food. The three women studied each photograph with an intensity that made James understand how completely isolated Japan had been. Emiko Watanabe pointed to an image of a supermarket, shelves stacked with products.
This is real? Not propaganda?
It's real, James confirmed. That's a grocery store. Regular people shop there. You pick what you want, pay for it, take it home. Suki's eyes widened.
How much food? How much can someone buy?
As much as they can afford and carry, James said. Then, seeing their disbelief, he added, Look, America has its problems, serious problems. But food isn't one of them. We produce so much food that the government pays farmers not to grow certain crops, to keep prices stable. The concept was incomprehensible to women from a country where rice had been rationed since 1941, where families had survived on bare minimum calories, where children had gone hungry while the military consumed the nation's resources. Yumi translated for Suki, and all three sat in silence, processing this reality. Over subsequent evenings, James explained concepts that challenged everything they had been taught. He described labor unions, organizations where workers collectively negotiated with owners for better conditions. He explained public schools, free education provided by the government to all children, regardless of wealth. He described libraries, buildings filled with books that anyone could borrow without cost.
In Japan,
Yumi said quietly on November 14th,
education beyond elementary school cost money most families didn't have. Books were expensive, carefully preserved. The idea of free access to unlimited books sounds like fantasy.
James found himself defending a country that had never fully defended him. America's not perfect, far from it. But the idea behind it is powerful. The idea that government exists to serve people, not the other way around. That everyone deserves opportunity. That power comes from citizens, not emperors or kings. He paused. The reality doesn't always match the idea, especially for Black folks. But the idea itself is worth something. The most profound teaching moment came on November 17th. Emiko asked about voting, a concept that Japanese propaganda had portrayed as chaos, the mob ruling through ignorance. James explained how American democracy functioned, how citizens elected representatives, how power transferred peacefully.
Women vote in America?
Yumi asked, astonished. Since 1920, James confirmed. Took a long fight, but yes, women vote, hold office, participate in government.
And Black Americans?
Emiko pressed. James's jaw tightened. Legally, yes, since 1870. In practice, Southern states make it almost impossible. Poll taxes, literacy tests, violence. The right exists on paper. Reality is different. He met their eyes. That's what I meant about America's contradiction.
The ideals are beautiful. The execution is flawed. But at least the ideals exist. At least people can point to the Constitution and say, "This is what you promised us. Now deliver." On November 18th, Suki spoke more words in a single conversation than she had in the previous month. Through Yumi's translation and her own improving English, she articulated something that had been forming in her mind. In Japan, we were taught to serve. Serve the emperor, serve men, serve the nation. Our worth came from our usefulness to others. But in America, you say people have worth simply because they are human, not because of what they do or who they serve, but because they exist. This idea is revolutionary. James nodded slowly. That's the idea, anyway. The real America doesn't always live up to it. But yeah, that's the foundation. All men are created equal. We're still fighting about what all means, who counts as equal. But the statement exists. It creates pressure toward justice, even when justice is delayed. As the evening ended, Yumi spoke with the precision of someone who had taught complex concepts to young minds. You have taught us that America is neither the perfect democracy we now see through your eyes, nor the corrupt chaos our propaganda described. It is something more complicated, a nation with beautiful ideals and terrible failures, struggling between what it claims to be and what it actually is. That's exactly right, James said. And maybe that struggle is what makes it worth defending. Not because it's perfect, but because it's trying. November 19th through November 28th, 1945. The transformation of Barracks 7 had not gone unnoticed by other camp personnel. Captain Theodore Walsh, whose commitment to regulations had defined camp operations, mentioned in his November 20th daily report to Pacific Command that morale among Japanese female detainees had improved significantly. What Walsh didn't document was the reason. That Private First Class James Mitchell had become something between guard and bridge, creating connections that military protocol had never anticipated. The grace that the three women witnessed during these 10 days came in forms both small and significant. On November 20th, a supply shipment arrived containing winter clothing. Army regulations stipulated that detainees were entitled to adequate clothing for climate conditions. The supply sergeant, Staff Sergeant William Chen from San Francisco, distributed standard-issue items to all barracks. But when he reached Barracks 7, he included something extra. 3 wool scarves, Army surplus, green and scratchy, but warm. Gets cold at night now, Chen explained to James, who was helping with distribution. Regulations don't specifically mention scarves, but they don't specifically prohibit them either. He handed them over with a small smile. Between you and me, Mitchell, whatever you're doing with these women is working. They're the only Japanese detainees who don't look at us with pure hatred. Keep doing it. When James delivered the scarves, Emiko Watanabe examined hers with careful attention to detail that reflected her nursing training. This is surplus military property, yes? Not required by Geneva Convention? Yes, James admitted. Then this is gift, not obligation, Emiko said quietly. Someone chose to give us warmth we do not technically deserve. She wrapped the scarf around her neck, and for a moment, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Kindness is harder to accept than cruelty. Cruelty confirms what you were taught. Kindness demands you reconsider everything. On November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, the camp kitchen prepared a traditional American feast. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. Army regulations required that all personnel, including detainees, receive adequate holiday meals. But Sergeant Harris went beyond adequate. He ensured that Barracks 7 received portions equal to those served to American soldiers,
not the reduced rations typically allocated to detainees. When James delivered the meal, the three women stared at the plates in disbelief. Yumi Tanaka spoke with a voice that trembled despite her attempt at composure. "This is what American soldiers eat? This abundance?" "On holidays, yes," James confirmed. Thanksgiving is about gratitude, about recognizing we have enough to share. Suki Kobayashi touched the turkey with one finger, as if confirming it was real. "In Japan, most families did not eat meat even before the war. This would feed my entire village." She looked up at James, confusion and something approaching pain in her eyes. "How can you share this with us? We are your enemy. Our nation killed American soldiers, yet you give us feast meant for celebration." James sat down in his usual position, just outside the barracks door. "My mama used to say that grace means giving people what they need, not what they deserve. If we only gave people what they deserved, none of us would receive much. Grace means recognizing we're all human, all struggling, all needing more kindness than the world typically offers." The women ate slowly, savoring each bite. The Thanksgiving meal, documented in the camp's food service records as standard holiday allocation, represented something more profound than nutrition. It was tangible proof that their enemy possessed resources so vast they could feast while fighting a global war. More significantly, it proved their enemy chose to share that feast with defeated opponents. On November 25th, an incident occurred that would test whether the grace James had shown could extend beyond one man's actions. Private Eddie Hayes from Brooklyn, pulling night watch duty, discovered that someone had damaged camp property. A section of fence near Barracks 7 showed signs of tampering. Not escape attempt, exactly. More like someone had been testing whether the fence could be moved, whether freedom might be possible. Hayes reported this to Sergeant Harris at 0600 on November 26th. Protocol demanded investigation, identification of the responsible party, and punishment according to military regulations. Harris, in turn, brought the matter to James during morning formation. "The fence damage is near your barracks, Mitchell. You've built rapport with those women. Any idea who might have tried to tamper with camp security?" James felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew who was responsible. Suki. He had seen her testing the fence 3 nights earlier during his evening rounds. She hadn't been attempting escape. She had been checking whether she could escape if she needed to, a trauma response from someone who had learned that survival meant always knowing the exits. He had said nothing then, hoping she would stop on her own. Now that hope had complicated into a choice. Tell the truth and watch Suki face punishment for violating camp security. Or lie to protect someone who had begun to trust him, someone whose fragile healing might be destroyed by punishment that confirmed her worst fears about American captivity. Harris waited for an answer, his weathered face revealing nothing but infinite patience. The sergeant had seen war long enough to understand that some choices came with no good options, only varying degrees of cost. "Sergeant," James began carefully, "I believe the damage was accidental. Wind stress on a section that was already weakened. These temporary camps weren't built for permanent structures. Wood degrades fast in this climate." Harris held James's gaze for a long moment. The lie was transparent between them, acknowledged without being spoken. Finally, Harris nodded once. "Probably right. We'll have maintenance reinforce that section. No need for investigation if it's weather damage." Later that evening, when James delivered the meal rations, Suki approached him directly for the first time without Yumi's intermediary presence. She bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect and apology.
You protected me, she said in careful English. You knew I tested the fence. You could have reported this. You chose not to. Why? James thought about his mother in Detroit, about growing up black in a city where white police could arrest you for being in the wrong neighborhood, where one mistake could mean prison or worse. He thought about grace, undeserved, but necessary. Because you weren't trying to escape. You were trying to feel safe. And because punishment would have destroyed the trust we've been building. That trust matters more than a damaged fence. Suki's eyes filled with tears. In Japan, I would have been beaten, perhaps killed, for dishonoring those who guard me. You dishonored yourself instead, telling untruth to your superior. This sacrifice I do not understand. It's called mercy, James said quietly. Sometimes it means choosing relationship over rules. Sometimes it means believing people are more important than regulations. November 29th through December 5th, 1945. The incident that would force a public reckoning began with something trivial. Camp regulations, outlined in the Pacific Command Detainee Management Manual, specified that all detainees must participate in daily physical exercise and camp maintenance duties. These requirements served multiple purposes. They maintained health, prevented idleness, and established routine. Most detainees complied without resistance, understanding that cooperation made captivity more bearable. But on December 1st, Yumi Tanaka refused. The refusal came during the morning inspection when Corporal Hayes informed Barracks 7 residents that they were assigned to kitchen cleanup detail. Yumi, who had been compliant for 2 months, simply shook her head. No, we will not do this today. Hayes, confused and uncomfortable with confrontation, repeated the order. Ma'am, it's not optional. All detainees participate in camp duties. That's regulation. I understand regulation, Yumi replied in her precise English. I am refusing anyway. The standoff lasted 15 minutes before Hayes, increasingly nervous, reported the situation to Sergeant Harris. Harris, demonstrating the patience that had kept him alive through 3 years of combat, approached Barracks 7 himself. He found Yumi standing at attention, her 2 companions behind her, all 3 presenting a united front that was both dignified and defiant. Miss Tanaka, Harris began carefully. Can you tell me what's happening here? Yumi's voice remained calm, but her words carried weight that demanded attention. Yesterday, we learned that Japanese detainees in Camp 14 were denied medical care when they fell ill. 2 women died. American doctors were available. American medicine existed. But these women were classified as enemy nationals, undeserving of resources. They died preventable deaths because someone decided regulations mattered more than humanity. The information had come through the camp's informal network, whispered conversations between detainees during work details, rumors that traveled faster than official communications. Captain Walsh had received preliminary reports about Camp 14, but had not shared details with camp population. Now those details had leaked, and they carried implications that threatened to undo months of careful relationship building. Harris absorbed this information, his expression neutral, but his mind calculating rapidly. I don't know details about Camp 14. If what you say is true, it's a violation of Geneva Convention standards. But that's a different camp, different command. That's not what happens here. But it could happen here, Yumi said quietly. What protects us except the temporary kindness of individuals? Today we have you and Mitchell-san. Tomorrow you might be transferred. Someone like the commander of Camp 14 might replace you. And then we would discover that all this grace, all this unexpected humanity, was simply fortunate circumstance, not guarantee.
Emiko Watanabe stepped forward, adding her voice.
For 2 months, we have been treated well. Better than we expected. Better than we deserved, perhaps. But we are realizing that this treatment depends on individuals, not systems. Your Private Mitchell shows us kindness. You show us respect. But the system allowed those women at Camp 14 to die. The system is flawed. And we are refusing to cooperate with a flawed system.
Harris stood silent, recognizing the impossible position these women had created. They were right. The treatment they received at Camp 17 was exceptional because of individuals who chose to exceed regulations. But regulations themselves provided only minimum standards, and minimum standards interpreted by cruel commanders could mean death. The women of Barracks 7 were not just refusing work detail. They were refusing to pretend that kindness guaranteed safety. "I need to report this to Captain Walsh," Harris said finally. "He'll want to address this directly. Understand that refusing orders is serious. There will be consequences."
We understand, Yumi said. We accept consequences. But we will not cooperate while other camps murder Japanese women through neglect.
When James arrived for his afternoon shift at 1400 hours, he found Camp 17 in a state of controlled tension. Captain Walsh had ordered all 3 women confined to Barracks 7, pending disciplinary review. Other detainees, learning of the refusal, watched with mixture of fear and hope. Would the Americans respond with punishment that confirmed their worst expectations? Or would they demonstrate that the humanity shown in Barracks 7 extended to difficult moments? James approached Sergeant Harris, who was smoking a cigarette outside the command post, his usual calm replaced by visible concern.
What's the situation, Sergeant?
Harris exhaled smoke slowly. Your 3 women refused direct orders. Walsh is considering disciplinary action. Could be loss of privileges. Could be transfer to maximum security facility. Could be formal charges under military occupation law. He's reviewing regulations now, trying to determine appropriate response. They had a reason, James said. Did they tell you about Camp 14? They told me, Harris confirmed. I radioed Pacific Command for information. Got confirmation 30 minutes ago. 2 Japanese women died at Camp 14 on November 28th. Official cause listed as typhoid fever. Unofficial reports suggest medical treatment was delayed because camp commander didn't want to waste resources on enemy nationals. It's a scandal. Heads will roll. But that doesn't change the fact that your 3 women just committed insubordination. James felt anger rising, not at Yumi and her companions, but at the impossible choice they faced. Cooperate with a system that might kill them, or resist and face punishment for resistance. What's Walsh going to do? Don't know yet, Harris admitted, but he's calling for a disciplinary hearing tomorrow morning. 0900 hours. He wants you there as the primary guard assigned to Barracks 7. You'll need to testify about their behavior over the past 2 months. That evening, James delivered the dinner rations in silence. The 3 women accepted their food with quiet dignity. Finally, Yumi spoke.
You are angry with us?
No, James said immediately. Then, more honestly, I'm angry at the situation. You're right about Camp 14. You're right that the system failed those women. But refusing orders puts you at risk. Walsh is a by-the-book officer. He'll follow regulations even if he doesn't want to.
We know,
Emiko said softly.
But we cannot pretend this kindness you show us is guaranteed. We cannot accept grace from you while ignoring that other camps offer only cruelty. We must resist, even if resistance brings punishment.
Suki, who rarely spoke during difficult moments, added quietly,
You taught us that America values principles over convenience, that people should speak truth even when truth is uncomfortable. We are speaking truth. Your system allows some camps to murder, while other camps show mercy. This is not acceptable. James had no response. They were using his own words, his own explanations of American ideals, to justify resistance against American authority. The contradiction was perfect and damning. He had taught them to expect justice, and now they were demanding it. December 6th, 1945, 0900 hours. The disciplinary hearing convened in Camp 17's administrative building, a simple wooden structure that served multiple purposes, including command post, communications center, and now courtroom. Captain Theodore Walsh sat behind a folding table that constituted his bench. Sergeant Harris stood to his right, formal and expressionless. Private First Class James Mitchell stood at attention to the left, called as witness. And in front of the table stood Yumi Tanaka, Emiko Watanabe, and Suki Kobayashi, 3 women whose refusal to clean a kitchen had become something larger than anyone anticipated. Walsh opened the proceedings with military formality. This hearing is convened to address insubordination by detainees housed in Barracks 7. The detainees refused direct orders from camp personnel on December 1, 1945. Under Pacific Command regulations, refusal to comply with lawful orders constitutes grounds for disciplinary action up to and including transfer to maximum security facilities. He looked at the 3 women. Do you understand the charges? Yumi, serving as spokesperson, nodded once. We understand. Do you dispute that you refused orders? No, we refused. Walsh leaned back, his expression revealing nothing. Then this hearing will determine appropriate punishment. He turned to James. Private Mitchell, you've been primary guard for these detainees since September. Describe their general behavior and compliance level. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was the moment. He could testify to their perfect compliance over 2 months, making this single refusal appear aberrational. Or he could testify to something more complicated. Truth or protection. He chose truth. Sir, the women in Barracks 7 have complied with every regulation and order since their arrival. They've participated in all required activities, maintained cleanliness standards, caused 0 disciplinary problems. They've been model detainees. He paused. Until they learned that women at Camp 14 died because someone decided regulations mattered more than medical care. Walsh's eyes narrowed. Are you testifying as to their motivation for refusal? Yes, sir. They refused because they lost faith that the system will protect them, and based on what happened at Camp 14, their lack of faith seems justified. The silence that followed was absolute. James had just criticized military occupation policy in an official hearing. Sergeant Harris's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been approval. Walsh, the by-the-book officer, found himself facing subordinate testimony that made enforcement of the book problematic. Private Mitchell, Walsh said slowly. Are you suggesting these detainees were justified in refusing orders? James met his commanding officer's gaze. Sir, I'm suggesting that these women are responding rationally to a system that allows some camps to provide excellent care while other camps allow preventable deaths. They're not refusing to work. They're refusing to pretend that individual kindness guarantees systemic justice. Walsh turned to Yumi. Is Private Mitchell's assessment accurate? You refused orders because of events at another camp? Yes, Yumi confirmed. We have been treated well here, but we recognize that this treatment is exceptional, not standard. The system that allows Camp 14 to exist also governs Camp 17. Today we have good officers. Tomorrow we might not. We refuse to cooperate with a system that permits such variation in basic humanity.
The captain was trapped in a logic problem with no clean solution. Punish the women for speaking truth about systemic failure, confirming their fear that mercy was arbitrary. Or acknowledge the system's flaws, undermining the authority that regulations provided. He chose a third option. The events at Camp 14 are under investigation, Walsh said formally. The commanding officer has been relieved pending inquiry. Pacific Command has issued new directives requiring all camps to maintain identical standards for medical care, regardless of detainee nationality. These changes are direct response to failures that should never have occurred. He paused. Your refusal to cooperate was technically insubordination. However, your motivation was to highlight systemic inequity that Command is now addressing. Therefore, I'm issuing a formal reprimand, but no additional punishment. Yumi's eyes widened. Reprimand only? Reprimand only, Walsh confirmed. But understand this. You've made your point. Command has responded. Future refusals will not receive the same leniency. Am I clear? All three women nodded. But Yumi wasn't finished. Captain Walsh, may I speak further? Walsh, who clearly wanted this hearing concluded, sighed. Proceed. Private Mitchell lied to protect one of us several weeks ago when camp property was damaged. He told Sergeant Harris it was weather damage. It was not. I tested the fence, checking whether escape was possible. Mitchell's son knew this. He chose to protect me rather than report accurately. She stood straighter. I dishonor him by allowing his lie to stand unacknowledged. He showed mercy I did not deserve. I want this mercy recognized officially. The admission created another impossible moment. Yumi had just confessed to property damage and implicated James in falsifying a report. Walsh could ignore it, pretending he hadn't heard confession of previous infractions. Or he could address it, punishing both parties according to regulations that had been violated. James felt sweat on his back despite the cool morning air. He had lied to a superior officer. Concrete violation of military code. Possible court-martial offense depending on severity judgment. His career, possibly his freedom, depended on Walsh's next words. The captain studied James for a long moment. Then he spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing words that would be documented. Private Mitchell, did you falsify a report regarding fence damage? Yes, sir, James admitted. There was no point lying now. I believed the situation didn't warrant punishment that might destroy trust we'd been building. You prioritized relationship over regulation. Yes, sir. Walsh was silent. Finally, he spoke with something that might have been grudging respect. The military requires regulations because war is chaos. But regulations that destroy human connection serve no strategic purpose. Your judgment call, while technically improper, served larger goals of camp stability and detainee cooperation. He paused. Consider this a verbal warning. Don't make it a habit. James could barely believe what he was hearing. Walsh, the strictest by-the-book officer in Pacific Command, had just chosen mercy over regulation. Twice in one hearing. This hearing is concluded, Walsh said, standing. All parties return to normal duties. Sergeant Harris, Private Mitchell, remain briefly. When the three women had left, Walsh spoke quietly. Mitchell, whatever you're doing with those three is working. They trust you enough to confess their own infractions to protect your honor. That level of trust between captor and captive is unprecedented in my experience. It's also valuable. Maintain it. But follow regulations going forward. Understood? Yes, sir. Dismissed. As James walked back toward Barracks 7, Sergeant Harris fell into step beside him. You took a big risk in there, son.
Had to tell the truth, Sergeant.
Not about that, Harris said. About criticizing the system. You could have testified to their compliance without commentary, but you chose to explain why they refused. You made Walsh choose between punishment and justice. That took courage.
James shrugged. Seemed like the right thing.
Harris smiled slightly. Your mama would be proud, teaching you that right things matter more than safe things. That evening, when James delivered dinner rations, he found all 3 women waiting at the barracks door. Yumi spoke formally.
Mitchell-san, we owe you debt we cannot repay. You defied orders to care for Emiko when she was ill. You lied to protect Suki. Today, you risked your career to defend our refusal. These mercies are more than we deserve.
You don't owe me anything, James said quietly.
Yes, Yumi insisted. We do. And we pay by promising this. When this war finally ends, when we return to Japan and begin rebuilding, we will tell everyone about the Black American soldier who taught us that enemies are just labels, that humanity transcends nationality, that grace means giving people what they need rather than what they deserve. Your mercy will echo through generations. This is how we repay debt we owe.
December 23, 1945 through June 1997. The final chapter of Barracks 7 began with an ending that felt like a beginning. On the cold morning of December 23rd, official orders arrived from Pacific Command. All Japanese civilian detainees at Camp 17 were to be processed for repatriation. The war had been over for 4 months. Occupation authorities had established new governance structures. The time had come for displaced persons to go home, whatever home meant after everything had been destroyed. James Mitchell stood outside Barracks 7 as the 3 women prepared for departure. They owned nothing except the clothes they wore, the wool scarves Sergeant Chen had provided, and the black leather shoes that had started everything. Army regulations provided each repatriating detainee with $20 American currency, basic provisions for 3 days, and transportation to the nearest functioning Japanese port. Everything else they would have to rebuild from nothing. Yumi Tanaka approached James first, carrying something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small notebook filled with Japanese writing. Her diary. 3 months of observations, reflections, transformations, recorded in careful script.
This belongs in a museum someday,
she said in English that no longer trembled with uncertainty.
So people will know what happened here. Not the war, the other thing, the healing.
She placed the diary in James's hands.
Keep this safe. When enough time passes, when people are ready to understand, give this to someone who will preserve the story. The story of how 3 Japanese women learned that enemies are just people who haven't met yet.
Emiko Watanabe, who had arrived at Camp 17 angry and resistant, spoke with a voice that had found peace through unexpected grace.
I am returning to Osaka. My family, if they survived, will need a nurse. Japan will need nurses for many years. I will practice medicine, but I will also teach. I will tell everyone about the Black American soldier who sat through the night with a sick enemy, who chose humanity over regulations. This teaching will be my life's work.
Suki Kobayashi, the youngest, had grown stronger during her months in captivity than she had been in freedom under Japanese military control. She no longer flinched when Americans approached. Her nightmares had decreased from nightly to occasional. The shoes James had provided had become symbols of something larger than footwear.
In Hokkaido, My village was destroyed by war. I will return anyway. I will rebuild. And I will teach children about kindness that crosses enemy lines. I will tell them about Mitchell-san, who brought shoes to a stranger, who protected us when he could have punished us, who showed us that humanity is stronger than propaganda. The transport truck arrived at 10:00 hours. Sergeant Harris supervised the loading of 23 Japanese detainees being repatriated that day. But he lingered at Barrack 7, understanding that something significant was ending. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "whatever happened here, it mattered. These 3 women arrived as enemies. They're leaving as witnesses to something better than war." James had no words adequate to the moment. He had done his job, fed them, protected them, treated them as his mother had taught him to treat all people, with dignity. That
Circumstances couldn't diminish. He hadn't intended to change lives. He had simply tried to be decent in circumstances that made decency difficult. But Yumi had final words that would echo through decades.
James Mitchell from Detroit, son of Loretta Mitchell. We came here expecting monsters. We found a man who shared chocolate and sat with the sick and protected the frightened. You gave us something more valuable than freedom. You gave us proof that hate is learned and can be unlearned, that enemies can become friends, that grace is stronger than vengeance.
The truck drove away at 10:45. James never saw them again in person, but the story didn't end at Camp 17. In 1997, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum opened an exhibition titled Reconciliation Through Humanity: Stories from Occupation Camps. Among the artifacts was Yumi Tanaka's diary, donated by James Mitchell, who had kept it safe for 52 years. Beside it were letters that 3 women had sent to a Detroit address over 5 decades. Letters describing their post-war lives, their work promoting peace, their efforts to teach new generations that prejudice could be overcome through simple human connection. The exhibition's opening ceremony included testimony from Emiko Watanabe, now 73 years old, a retired nurse who had spent 50 years teaching medical students about humanitarian treatment of all patients, regardless of nationality. "In 1945, she told the assembled crowd, I believed Americans were demons. One American soldier proved me wrong. He taught me that we are all just people trying to survive, trying to do right in circumstances that make right nearly impossible. This lesson shaped everything that followed." James Mitchell attended that ceremony, 74 years old, retired from 30 years teaching history at Detroit Public Schools. When asked to speak, he said simply what his mother had taught him. Grace means giving people what they need, not what they deserve. These 3 women taught me that grace can change the world. One person at a time. One act of kindness at a time. That's how wars really end. Not with treaties. With people choosing to see humanity in unexpected places. The connection between one Black American soldier and 3 Japanese women lasted 6 decades. It began with fear and propaganda. It transformed through chocolate and shoes and midnight vigils beside sick enemies. It endured through letters and memories and a shared understanding that hate is expensive and love costs less. Their story, preserved in diaries and museums and hearts, stands as testimony. Reconciliation begins not with governments, but with individuals who choose compassion over convenience, who choose humanity over hatred, who choose to give enemies what they need most. Recognition that we are all, in the end, just people trying to find our way home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.